NBC10 at Issue.
And we're back now on NBC10 at Issue. I'm Steve Highsmith, and with me is U.S. Senator Pat Toomey, one of the most popular people in Washington, at least right now.
I'm not sure about that.
Well, you've got, I would think, every lobbyist in America knocking on your door. Is it like that for you and your other members?
I suppose, but we're now spending so much time among the select committee members in the process of trying to resolve this that there isn't a lot of time for meeting with lobbyists. So
I know some lobbyists have tried to do the legal, perhaps, but ethically questionable, let's pick these 12 members and find other ways of making them know they're there. We'll support fundraisers for this or that. Are any of your members taking advantage of that?
Not that I know of. You know, I don't think there's anything unusual happening on the fundraising front. You know, part of running for office is raising money. It always is. It's a sort of permanent feature, unfortunately. So it continues, but I don't think there's anything significantly different.
Let's say you get all this done and you get at least 7 votes and you present Congress with a plan. Congress votes on it. Can Congress change it next year?
Sure. Yeah, there's nothing that we can ever do to bind the hands of a future Congress, right? So any law that's passed can be unpassed. Mm-hmm. Having said that, let's take, for instance, the biggest driver of our budget deficits and the spending, and that's the big entitlement programs. If we make some structural changes, and in this committee, I think it's relatively unlikely that we would profoundly transform them, although I think that actually is needed. But nevertheless, if
but you think you may target a little bit?
Oh, I think we need to look at the drivers of what's giving us the deficits we have long term. In the short run, the last few years, it's been discretionary spending of this administration and Congress. But long term, it's the big entitlement programs. If we were to make some structural tweaks, those typically are enduring. So most likely they would last. But there's no guarantees. A future Congress can always undo what a previous Congress has done.
Do you have a feeling right now of optimism that there will be a majority opinion?
Yeah, you know, I'm cautiously optimistic. We've got a really tough job, and all of the ideas and issues that divide the full Congress, those separating ideas are present around the table of the 12 of us, too. But I do think there's a sense of urgency and a feeling that it's really important that we at least reach this statutory goal, demonstrate to the American people that Congress can function, at least at some level, because it's been doing such a bad job thus far.
Let me ask you a couple of quick ones here just about hypotheticals. I know you can't talk about some specifics, but average folks are worried about the things they have access to, and if you own a home, it's a mortgage deduction. Is there a danger they could be losing their mortgage?
You know, I'd rather not get into specific features in the tax code that may or may not be under discussion. As I said, you know, anything that we do, it's got to reduce the deficit. It's got to be pro-growth.
All right. What is the chance that you could come up with something short of 1.2, that you just can't agree on 1.2 trillion or more, and you do, you know, 600, 800 or whatever, and say, well, here, Congress, vote on this, and then next year you guys handle the rest of it, but this is enough to get us through the election. And let's see what the American people then say in November about which direction they want to go.
Well, you know, we don't need to hit a certain number in order to get through the year, so to speak. So, you know, the debt ceiling has already been raised. The government's ordinary funding will occur through separate mechanisms. It is possible that we won't reach an agreement on the full 1.2 trillion, but we could agree on something less. The direct consequence of that is the automatic spending cuts that we referred to in defense and other areas. They would then be diminished in proportion to the amount of the savings that we came up with.
All right. Let me ask you a couple of questions that are off this topic, and that has to do with something that's been talked about a lot last few weeks in political circles in Pennsylvania, and that's changing the Electoral College apportionment of votes. Do you think that ought to be touched?
You know, I think we ought to look at it. I think it's an intriguing idea. I haven't studied it a lot closely, and obviously it's a decision for the legislature, but it would give a more sort of democratic with a small d approach to the Electoral College. It'd be more consistent with the way the fact that Pennsylvania is a divided state. So I think it's something that ought to be considered.
So it ought to be considered. If Republicans initially after that are the party that would benefit from that, is there any way that this should be addressed by some bipartisan committee, as like your committee, that's even, as opposed to just because one party runs the legislature now?
Well, it's an inherent part of the political process, and so it makes sense. It'll be handled through the political system, and the voters can then decide whether they approve or disapprove of whatever they decide to do.
Your colleague, Bob Casey, is seeking re-election next year. There are a number of Republicans who have either declared or expressed interest in running.
Right.
I know that you get along very well with Senator Casey.
Yeah, I do.
But I would assume that you would prefer the Republican would be there. If that's the case, do you see anybody right now, like Tom Smith or Tim Burns, or people that you would say, you know, take a look at those folks?
I think we've got a pretty substantial field that seems to be emerging. I think we're going to have a multi-candidate field. I happen to know to varying degrees several of the candidates who are running, and these are some very impressive folks.
I'm not going to pick one.
I'm certainly not going to pick one. You know, the Pennsylvania Republican primary voters will pick one, and my guess is we'll have
a very... former campaign person's working for one of them.
I have folks from my campaign team seem to be spread around this field. But it's a good field. It's a strong field. I think the primary process will enable somebody to emerge who's probably going to be a very strong candidate, and I expect a very competitive race.
Senator, thank you very much, sir.
Thanks for having me,
the time, and good luck, especially in the next few weeks.
Thank you.
Still to come, the burners warming on Pennsylvania's political stove. As we mentioned, developments this week in the race for Attorney General, Senate, and President ahead on NBC 10 Edition. Stay tuned.